The one thing I do find interesting is I remember when, specifically in ultra running and then marathon running too, when we started seeing this kind of like big wave of like carbohydrate kind of swing into the conversation, was my first thought was, all right, how is this going to get misapplied and create a backlash? And then we're going to see like in 5-10 years, this like pendulum swing back, and all of a sudden like low carb will have another like a bump in popularity for a while as people like blow up their digestive systems on races and decide, okay, I'm not just going to titrate down, I'm going to go the opposite direction entirely.
So I do think viewing nutrition through the lens of how can I manipulate as many nutritional variables as possible to improve my recovery, and that's going to let me train more at higher volume training, which would lead to better performance, I think is something I find very fascinating. And you can do that across other modalities besides nutrition too to optimize your recovery. But I think nutrition is a very interesting one where it's like you view nutrition as a way to support training and recovery as much as possible. It's a recovery modality.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. I want to thank all my listeners for taking the time to check out my podcast. As a way to thank you, I am raffling off a free 30-minute consultation for anyone who shares an episode or leaves a review on your preferred platform. Just tag me or send me a screenshot and I will enter you in the monthly raffle. If you want to contact me, check out my coaching services or access additional podcast resources, including joining the show's Patreon page, please head over to zachbitter.com or send me an email at hpopodcast@gmail.com. A big thanks to Element Electrolytes, Delta G Ketones, ProBio ProBlend, and Training Peaks for being annual partners of the HPO podcast. Discounts include 20% off Training Peaks Premium and can be accessed with promo code HPOPOD at trainingpeaks.com/HPO podcast. 20% off ProBio ProBlend can be accessed at probionutrition.com/endurance or with promo code endurance. 20% off Delta G Ketones at deltagketones.com with promo code BITTER20, and a free sample pack with purchase at drinklmnt.com/HPO. All links and promo code discounts can be found in the show notes.
All right, Jonah, I think we're up. Thanks for taking some time and coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Big fan, so super excited to be here. You've had some legends on.
Yeah, it's been fun. The podcast has been such a cool vehicle to kind of grow and explore over the years. And yeah, it gives me opportunities to talk with guys like you, dive into some interesting stuff. And, thankfully there's enough people willing to listen to it that I can kind of keep doing it. So
Awesome. So I'm definitely one of those people. So there you go.
Right on. No, I'd love to hear it. So you were just at the LA Marathon this weekend, right?
Past weekend, I was just on the LA Marathon. Yeah, that was a great time. It was hot, but there was some great racing.
Yeah. Were you there running it, or were you there just...
I was there activated with Science and Sport, the supplement company,
Oh, right
and
on.
activated with the Endorphins running. But yeah, it was a great time. So I was not running it. I was cheering, which sometimes I've realized I enjoy more than running 26 miles in the heat.
Yeah, yeah.
But I
It
was
is
well
fun.
fueled for that too, though, where I was taking my gels to cheer.
Yeah. 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 It's funny because we bumped into each other at the running event at the end of last year. You were hanging out at the Science and Sport booth, and I came by to check out some of their stuff. I've been playing around with some of their product recently as I've kind of been getting things sorted for this upcoming race season and things like that. And they've got some exciting stuff on the market. Is there anything specific with their product line that you're excited about right now?
I mean, there's a few things I really like. I think a lot of it's just like the range of products they offer. But I mean, I love all the beta fuel stuff, specifically the beta fuel gels. Obviously, you get the dual source carbohydrates to help with higher fueling rates with the tolerance and absorption. But also like the whole beta fuel line, I think is really cool. One thing that people sleep on is the beta fuel recovery mix. It's definitely much more relevant for individuals like you and I, or like individuals who are training multiple times a day at high volumes, where they have a recovery mix that has protein, but also the beta fuel dual source of like maltodextrin and fructose. So obviously we know like fructose after a training session may help like replenish glycogen faster, specifically in the liver. So I think it's cool for like a recovery drink to help replenish liver glycogen before your next training session. But I love all the products, the beta fuel. I mean, the fact that they make gels with caffeine, without caffeine, with electrolytes, without electrolytes, single source carbs, dual source carbs, it's just like every single type of training situation, like you're going to have a product based for it, which I think is really cool.
Yeah. This last training cycle, I went all in on the high carb side of things to try to see what that would do for me potentially with the 100-mile racing. And, you get into that world and there's just so many products on the market now and a lot of good stuff too, where it seems like it's just a lot easier to find something that works for you. And kind of one of the entry points I think that people usually engage with that is like, what are those ratios going to do and why you'd maybe pick one over the other. So like, some are going to have like that 2-to-1 glucose to fructose ratio, whereas others are going to be more like 1 to 0.8.
Yep.
Yeah. Are you using those differently for certain circumstances?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So what you're referring to is historically, like when we have dual source of carbohydrate gels or drink mixes, we typically have both maltodextrin or glucose, which are very similar to the way they behave in the body, and then fructose. So two different sources of carbohydrates. And the reason we do that was based on some of the ledger research by Asker, which essentially like when you combine glucose and fructose, it lets your body, because they use different transporters in the stomach or they test it for absorption, like take on more carbs, absorb more carbs into the bloodstream per hour. And that lets you essentially use more carbs for energy. And so then what they try to do is like, okay, so what's the right ratio of glucose to fructose in the mixes so you can maximize absorption and reduce like GI stress? And it was first like 2-to-1, so 2 glucose for every 1 fructose. And that seems to work really well, especially up to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. But there's some newer research that shows like as individuals go above 90 grams, if you go close to 1 to 0.8, so a little more fructose to glucose, but still more glucose to fructose overall, but you're changing the ratio slightly, then it may actually help with absorption once you get to higher than 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. Everyone's a little different, but once you start to push those really high fueling rates, the 1 to 0.8 might actually be better for absorption and tolerance, which is important. But below that, I probably isn't going to make a gigantic difference if we're being completely honest. But yeah, I'm curious though, what products have you explored from SIS? And then also, have you noticed a difference with the higher carb fueling versus the lower carb historically?
Yeah, so the stuff I've been using from Science and Sport recently has been their like beta fuel.
Yep.
Pretty much I've done a little bit with their nootropic model one, but not enough to really know too much about it. So that may be something that you'd be able to share with me a little bit more context around if what they're looking for with that or what you've experienced with that. But yeah, my experience with it so far has been, I mean, it's like a 40-gram pouch. So you do take a pretty big bolus of it. So I'm curious to get back into kind of the longer stuff where I would engage with it a little bit more at a really high rate. Right now, I'm not quite at that point yet in training, but I'm basically going to enter that pretty soon. So I'll be able to do a little bit more thorough testing with just like the really high amounts of that, of their product line. Because I'm curious about what I'll notice if I try to push up above like 90 to 100 grams. Because so far I've kind of used that as sort of like the ceiling, but I do have some growing interest, I guess, as I kind of explore this world of just seeing what happens if I go up closer to 120 grams. So I think having that product in the rotation might be useful to push some of those higher numbers or, push above that 90-gram number consistently. I may require that. I'm always a big fan of caffeine from a performance standpoint. I think I respond really well to it. I don't seem to have, I shouldn't say I don't have issues with it. If I get kind of crazy with it, I do. I've talked about this on the podcast in the past, but I did have a scenario once where I was using a prototype product with caffeine, and my assumption was it was half the amount of what it actually was. So I ended up essentially doubling my caffeine target for what I was going for and had some digestive issues from that. But I hit like 1,000 milligrams in a 12-hour period. So I think that was probably more user error than it was necessarily like the caffeine not doing what it was intended to do. Had I been dosing it the way I normally would, it usually works quite well. So usually with products that kind of have the caffeine in with it, it's kind of nice to have that 2-for-1 opportunity to hit the fuel you're taking, get the caffeine, and kind of phase that in at the right times and dosages the way you want it. So yeah, I've really liked that. I would say in general, I'm really I'm optimistic about the really high carbohydrate side of things, just because one of the bigger pinch points for me historically was always finding a way to engage with it to a way where I felt like I could sustainably take in that much carbohydrate
Mm,
per hour. And that's just been one of the evolutions of ultra running
yep.
where we've essentially solved for that, in my opinion, in any way that you would need to make it incentivize yourself enough to do it if you're trying to compete. Because if you don't, a lot of other people are going to be able to. It's not going to be something where it's like just some rare occurrence that someone's able to hit 100 plus grams per hour. It's going to be like the entire podium and then some that are going to easily be able to do that. So at that point, you kind of eliminated that friction point that was maybe assumed earlier in the ultra running space. And then it's just like, okay, how do I structure things around that approach that makes it more doable? So my assumption is like, if I want to be hitting 100 plus grams of carbohydrate per hour, I don't see a great workaround outside of high carb daily nutrition. So that kind of comes along for the ride, I guess. It has been interesting though. Like I would say like carbohydrate consumption at really high rates, and granted, like the way I'm engaging with fuel is in the context of performance that probably goes beyond any strong argument for like health and longevity. Not that it's like terrible for those things, but I the way I like to look at it is like the way I engage with running probably crosses that optimal point if you're focusing primarily on I
Yeah.
want to optimize for health. Just because there's going to be trade-offs to train the way I do where like
Oh,
opportunity
100%.
costs essentially, yeah, like opportunity costs of like I could go to the gym and do something that would maybe also really help with health that I'm just not going to do as much of or none of because I'm
Yeah.
spending all my time and energy training for these 100-mile races. So like I just like lead with that usually because that becomes kind of a point of interest, I think, when people are determining like why am I doing what I'm doing versus what maybe someone else would maybe do. But yeah, I find it maybe a little trickier in the sense that you do have to engage with carbohydrate in a way that feels a little more sensitive is the way I maybe describe it. But when you get it right, it's like very potent as well. So
Exactly.
yeah, I'm finding like in a lot of it, I think just becomes intuitive after time. Once you've kind of got reps doing it, like anything, you don't really overthink complicated processes once you've really gotten good at them and really got rehearsed and you know how the experience is. Where for me over the last 8 months has sort of been learning what that looks like and how to get that into my rotation of things. So it just feels like it's on autopilot versus something I have to consciously put a lot of mental effort into. And, you know, that goes towards just like meal frequency and sizing, carbohydrate amounts per eating session, and then ultimately like during sessions, like how much carbohydrate to target for specific training sessions. And then on top of it, like what is the requirements I'm going to need to do in training to make sure that my digestive system is ready to tolerate what I'm going to do to it on race day. And that one was actually kind of surprising to me. I thought that was going to be a much harder process than it ended up being. Um, Granted, I haven't tried to go well north of 100 grams per hour yet, but I seem to pretty easily be able to train my gut up to 90 to 100
Yeah.
grams without any real issues at all during the races that I've done.
Oh man, I have a ton of thoughts. I'll ask you some questions and hit through them one by
Yeah.
one. But no, I totally think we've definitely, with a lot of the things that were limiting us historically for ultra runners was things like energy density of food. It was just super hard to get enough calories to support your training and the racing. But now with some of the new higher carb nutritional supplementation and things, it just makes it a lot easier with like the liquid forms to get a large amount of carbohydrates in a smaller concentration, which I think solves for a lot of that. Before I go on, I'm curious, do you ever experiment with do you still do any like low carb or like train low sessions at all? Or not really?
Yeah, you know, that's actually a great question because the one thing I was curious about is like when I kind of went 180 on that was like, what is my experience going to be like if I would just say go out for like a 2-3 hour long run with just water and electrolytes and not
Yeah,
introduce into the fuel? And because like one of the like I talked to like David Roche and other people about this, and they would always say along the fat ox side of questions is they're like, well,
exactly.
like
The fat
I can still
oxide.
do those sessions. Yeah, they didn't seem too concerned with it.
I think,
Uh,
yeah, I'm super biased. I have a few biases here. Number one is I think all the best endurance athletes I've ever trained in a lab, even if they're higher carbohydrate fueled, so high carbohydrate availability most of the time, they have
mhm,
extremely high rates of fat oxidation when you hook them up to a metabolic cart. So
mhm.
even though they're not really ever training low and they always have high carbohydrate availability, there's two things that come to mind. Just by the nature of their training, where they're running multiple times a day and doing such high volumes, they're going to naturally incur states of low carbohydrate availability and higher fat oxidation just because like by the end of some of those hard training sessions, glycogen is just running low just by the nature of the high volume training, and they'll get those adaptations. And I also think it comes to the point that the biggest stimulus to create like more mitochondria or some of the things that lead to high fat oxidation, the ability to use high levels of fat as a fuel, comes from consistent high volume training. And if high carbohydrate availability and high carbohydrate fueling allows you to train more, you're going to create the metabolic stress on the system that's going to lead to the underlying physiological adaptations like more mitochondria, some of the enzymatic activity that leads to high fat oxidation. And all the best endurance athletes, the best marathoners, the best runners I've ever tested, even though a lot of them do eat a lot of carbs, are still unbelievable, have the unbelievable ability to metabolize and oxidize high levels of fat, much more than most individuals per hour, just from the training stimulus, I would say. But they probably do incur some levels of low carbohydrate training just by the nature of the high volume training. It's just something that comes along with it. But I do think that whatever allows you to maintain high volumes and consistent training is going to lead to the best fat adaptations. And that may be with high carbohydrates because you're recovering better.
Yeah, I would say that because I have done that a few times where I've just gone out for like a 20-mile long run and said, okay, I'm just not going to, when I'm far enough along into this experience where there's like, I've had plenty of a washout period from my low carb days. And I, generally speaking, like if there's nothing quality in there outside of just like a steady effort below zone 2,
too much.
No, I don't notice too much. Like if maybe a little bit at the end, I start noticing like, you know what, if I hit a gel right now, I'd probably feel a little bit better. But the bar for quality at that intensity is pretty low.
I do go back and forth because one thing you can't argue with, like you study some of the elite Kenyan runners and Ethiopian runners, they do a ton of sessions fasted, probably with low carbohydrate availability, these marathoners. And there maybe is something to be said, like fuel for the work required. And like some of the famous researchers like James Morton and them, they still like potentially advocate, or there is still times where it's like, if you're going for a long, easy, low intensity ride, like going with low carbohydrate availability might increase a metabolic stress, right? Like that's a higher metabolic stress, which may lead to more metabolic adaptations. Listen, take it with a grain of salt, but like a lot of those African runners, the Kenyan and Ethiopian runners still do a lot of like probably low carbohydrate availability studies and are extremely high fat, have the ability to incur high levels of fat oxidation. Even when you test them after a few hours of running with high carbohydrate intake, they're still burning a ton of fat, and that may lead to high levels of performance since they have high fat oxidation and high carb oxidation at the same time. So overall high energy turnover. So it's one of those things where it's like, is there still a potential advantage to some sessions that are low carbohydrate to improve the metabolic stress? Maybe. It's really hard to say. I still think consistent training over time is most important. But like if you have an easy long run or just an easy run, like if you do it with low carbohydrate availability, there's not a ton of like quality in it, and you don't think that that low carb is going to impact the run, that I don't know if it's a terrible idea. Listen, if you struggle with things like low energy availability and like red ass and like getting enough calories, I definitely never recommend it. But there are times too where it's like, I don't know, it may not be a terrible thing, and some athletes still do it.
Yeah, it's almost like anything where I think if you try to leverage that too frequently, you probably run into problems. And if you leverage it never, you maybe leave something on the table.
It is no secret if you listen to this podcast that I am a big fan of perceived effort when it comes to guiding your training efforts. This can be a learning process though, and can be supported with lots of post-workout tools. Training Peaks is one of the best tools for monitoring your training progress and my go-to tool when coaching individuals and with my own training assessments. At Training Peaks, you can get deep into the data, assess training load, recovery, and easily monitor progress across all training intensities. It is the perfect example of a program that takes much of the guesswork out of your training and coaching experience by making sure you have multiple data points pointing in the right direction to inform your training inputs. You can get 20% off a premium subscription with promo code HPOPOD by heading to trainingpeaks.com/HPO podcast. Details and links can be found in the show notes.
I don't know if you read, Killian Jornet had that write-up about everything along the lines of just like metabolic processes with these high active individuals. And if there's like a metabolic ceiling, so to speak, in terms of like energy, like is there a cap on how much energy we can burn? And just a fascinating write-up.
Some of the new stuff about the metabolic ceiling and energy expenditure is really fascinating. And it comes from a lot of the work from Herman Potzner's lab and
Mhm.
Eric Trexler, who's doing great stuff. And then you could talk, there's other individuals like Javi Gonzalez, Dr. Javi Gonzalez, who's doing great stuff on this too. And the theory is like, is there actually a set point about the amount of energy we can burn in a day and like the caloric expenditure our body's going to let us? And also like Ater, Vhr, and other researchers, just want to give credit. Where like historically they think over a long period of time, like you can only, and Boston here, just this study, sorry, do like 2.5 times your metabolic rate of your resting metabolic rate, like hold that daily caloric expenditure for extremely long periods of time, just because like the body has like some kind of defense system where like it's not going to let you burn more than that. And there may be some like individuals who can go closer to 2.9 or 3, and that's like Killian, should
Mhm.
Blumenfeld for long periods of time. And in the short term, you may be able to do whatever, like 4 to 5 times your daily. But like in the long term, it does seem like people do tend to go to that 2.5 times resting metabolic rate for some kind of defense system. And there's some variability. And the
Mhm.
variability may be like people like Killian, like Christian Blumenfeld could absorb more calories or intake more calories and their digestive system could absorb. And that calorie intake allows them to output more. But it is a very interesting topic.
Yeah, and I mean, one of my curiosities within that whole time frame is something of the nature where like anything in endurance, a long timeline gives you an advantage.
Exactly.
When we look at just like aerobic development of how long of a process that can actually be to optimize, I think there may be something there with like your ability to train up your caloric expenditure like ceiling with respect to how you're engaging with fuel over those years of development too, where if you're someone who is chronically underfed during the activity sessions you're doing, and then certainly just in general too, I bet you end up limiting that versus say somebody like Christian Blumenfeld's probably the best example, because he seems like a guy who's
Yeah.
fueling all the time. It's like
Yeah.
his body may be set up in a way where it's engaging with an incoming energy source so frequently
It's so
that
fascinating because I
pushes
think
that
like,
ceiling up.
yeah, this is where you get into things like the microbiome and stuff. And it's like, you look at people who like historically like were deprived of food and like how that changes the resting metabolic rate, maybe short term, long term, we don't really know, or vice versa. So it's like if you have the ability to absorb a lot of the food or not absorb a lot of the food you're ingesting, because there probably is some individual variability where it's like every calorie you eat, you know, to actually absorb and use for like energy or rebuilding. Some of it just is like waste. Like
Mhm.
that's like the thermic effect of food and stuff. So like if there's some individual variability, if someone's really great at essentially absorbing all the calories they get from food, that's more calorie intake. Could they potentially train more? That's like a very interesting thing to think about. I've had some conversations with people and like maybe Christian Blumenfeld could just absorb every single ounce of calorie or a ton of calories from the food he intakes, which lets him train more. I guess that's something I'm curious about. When you've gone to higher carbohydrate fueling, because something I've thought about too, like, do you feel like you recover better? Because if you recover better with the higher carbohydrate fueling in session, maybe it leads to better glycogen replenishment post if it's still sitting there, like, and allows you to accumulate more high quality training volume. That could potentially be an advantage too. Have you noticed any difference recovery wise?
Yeah, it's an interesting point because I would say if I look at it through like a little bit of a shorter term lens of like the last 4 or 5 years, there was a pretty noticeable improvement there where I hit like my biggest training block since my
Mm,
wife and I moved to Austin 4 years ago. And it was like I was hitting the way I look at like peak training is I kind of have this range where it's like I want to land in this range, but I'm going to listen to my body as to where it is. So like at best, I'm sometimes at the top end of that range, and then maybe at
yeah.
worst, I'm near the bottom, and more often than that, somewhere in the middle. I was hitting the top ends of that to the degree where it was like I felt like I could maybe go more if I had to, but I also knew that I was getting on thin ice with, I mean, I was already at like 150 mile per week training. So I was like, I'm probably on thin ice. I don't really want to necessarily tempt it beyond that for this particular training cycle. And so that stood out. But I would say if I map that on to just the history of training in total from when I started ultra running to today, I wouldn't say it exceeded some of my bigger training blocks of, in terms of volume and relative training load, definitely matched the biggest ones I had done though. So
And how did you
who
feel like
knows?
perceptually?
Yeah.
Did you
And
feel
then
any different?
I felt different for sure. It was just kind of interesting in like the ways I felt different, where I felt like if I were to do something on a little bit higher on the aerobic intensity spectrum, it was a lot easier to generate that
Mm,
sort of performance, even within fatigue. Whereas like if I were fatigued enough, it would have been much more of a challenge to try to do that type of a session, or if I did, it would come in at a lower quality. I don't know that it necessarily changed a ton about how I felt with respects to doing kind of the real specific stuff to 100-mile running, like a
Yeah.
3-hour long run on the back end of another 3-hour long run. That I would say it was on par with the best I've ever felt doing that, but maybe not in excess of that.
Interesting. Yeah, I think something that is interesting with the higher carbohydrate fueling is number one, that one paper like that from HRV, or I don't know if you saw it in mountain running, that went to 120 grams per hour, and they saw
Mhm.
improved recovery the next day, and like lower RPE. So that is one interesting thing. It's like, well, maybe higher carb fueling, if it's not even, you're going to use all the carbohydrates during that session because you're just not absorbing all of them. If they're sitting there and then they're available for you post session, maybe that
Mhm.
improves your recovery and the next day muscle damage, because there's some relationship between muscle damage and glycogen and levels and all that and the way the body interacts. So that is an interesting thing if it helps you recover faster, even though like the carbs may not be used in that session, they help you recover post session if it's higher carb fueling. And obviously the psychological elements of like glucose in the body is interesting too, since that is your brain's fuel source. And the other thing is the durability, where like some of the thing we do see, especially in marathoners, it may not be as relevant for like longer duration ultras, is like durability is complex. So the ability to maintain your output as the race goes on. Well, it's
Mhm.
obviously that hot topic, like the decay of thresholds, running economy, and VO2 max. But there does seem to be something where like the ability to maintain high carbohydrate oxidation and prevent that crossover to where fat becomes the predominant fuel source for like a marathon does seem to correlate with some element of durability, where you're going to be maintain your running economy and form later in a race if you can maintain higher carbohydrate oxidation versus switching over to fat as your main fuel source. And it makes sense. It's carbohydrate typically at
Mhm.
higher intensities is a more efficient fuel source.
Yeah, and another interesting thing that kind of goes along this line, and a little bit back to your question prior to with like the fasted long running versus the fed and stuff like that, is one spot that I do notice a pretty clear difference is in those second training sessions of the day,
Yep.
where it's almost to the point where I had to be a little careful because like it was almost easy to overdo the intent of
Overcook
that
it.
session.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas, like, there would have been, like, a much clearer, like, roadblock just in terms of desire when I was doing a big morning session and then a smaller afternoon session when I was low carb. With high carb, it felt like if I had wanted to, I could have made some bad decisions with my training. Um,
Definitely. I
uh,
understand for sure.
or the other way to look at that is, like, you stress test things up enough to the degree where now all of a sudden you're trying to pull that lever and do something like a double threshold session or something like that. Now all of a sudden I have a better opportunity to maybe thread that needle than I would uh,
Yeah.
previously.
It is interesting too, and like how you balance like the mechanical versus metabolic load. Like you don't want to do too much mechanically.
Hmm.
From that standpoint is one way I always like to look at it as well. So that's all.
Yeah.
One point I do want to address you brought up earlier is it's a question I've been getting a lot, and I'm definitely not an expert in this area, but I feel like I know enough to be dangerous, and there are some experts who I'm talking to, which is do we need to worry about with like high carbohydrate fueling if it has diminishing or negative effects on our health as endurance athletes is probably the right way to word it. And a lot of it comes back to this idea that it's going to lead to things like prediabetes or dysregulated like blood glucose and things that are signs of diabetes. And I think the one thing I will say, based on my understanding, just to clear it up, again, not an expert in this area, but from talking to experts, is it's about the energy intake versus energy output and that balance with a lot of these metabolic diseases. And we can think of it kind of like a sink where like, if you're a high volume endurance athlete, you have a high level of energy output. And when you have high levels of energy output, then you have high carbohydrate demands typically, and you're going to use a lot of those carbohydrates. We get into danger from a pre-diabetic standpoint when you have high levels of energy intake, but not energy output. So intake is much higher than output, and that's when you start to accumulate fat mass. And when you accumulate fat, actually fat leads to potential like inflammatory properties and things, especially around the visceral fat. So like the adipose fat, which is like that dangerous fat. And that's what typically leads to like the inflammatory properties that cause like dysregulation of blood glucose and that dysregulation of insulin versus glucose response, which typically is like the signs of underlying metabolic syndrome. But what we see in high level endurance athletes who have high levels of energy output and their energy intake is matched via calories and carbohydrates to their output, that they typically are extremely lean with low levels of adipose tissue and don't have those prediabetes, and those may be rare cases here and there, but I don't think it seems to have negative effects from the high carbohydrate intake as long as you have high carbohydrate output.
Yeah, my question with that sort of concern is always, you just made a massive, like, a professional athlete is typically going to make a massive lifestyle change upon
Exactly.
retirement, where like think of someone like, I don't know, like Lance Armstrong, or because
Yeah.
that guy was doing insane, or any tour cyclist is doing such a massive amount of training to the degree where they're doing training sessions that are not fun. It's purely in the mind of performance, probably detrimental to their long-term health. They're not going to do that when they retire, because why would you?
Exactly.
Like, so then it's like,
Exactly.
if I wonder about some of those, like, diet, to the degree that it's a concern in the first place. I haven't seen it. I mean, maybe it's there. Maybe there's data that shows, like, Tour de France athletes have a higher likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes post-career than the average person does. I haven't seen anything that
I
suggests
haven't
that.
seen it
Like,
either, and definitely not like prediabetes during their career, is what I will
right.
say as well. Again,
Mhm.
from my understanding of type 2 diabetes, the mechanism is actually more related to like adipose tissue accumulation in unwanted areas leading to this inflammatory response. And most endurance athletes I work with are actually extremely lean and have very healthy metabolic. One of the key determinants of type 2 or key signs of type 2 diabetes is the inability to like obviously handle like glucose and insulin, which is like that mismatch. And they're actually not insulin sensitive, where like the endurance athletes I work with are extremely sensitive to insulin. Like once they take carbohydrates, they actually have a very healthy insulin response. So again, just
Mhm.
my 2 cents regarding if you have to worry about carbohydrate intake and health for endurance athletes in particular, who the energy matches the output.
Yeah, yeah. So, like, my guess is similar to yours, where, like, the biggest risk factor is probably if you get someone who's like a Tour de France athlete
Yeah,
or like a marathon runners, you just have someone with a relatively low just mass in general, certainly compared to their energy intake. So if you take away that output, that's not kind of
exactly. That's
on
when
board.
it's dangerous. Yeah, I
Yeah,
totally
so
agree.
they do have some risks with that, like, kind of off ramping of their professional career, that they probably want to be concerned with the way they engage with food in general. And my guess is a lot of those type 2 diabetic situations are because they didn't engage with that in a way that was adequate. And that's going to be a slow process too, because it's like, if you're 125, 130 pound professional endurance athlete, and then you retire and you want a bigger metabolic sink for carbohydrate, the really only way to do that outside of continuing exercise is adding more muscle mass, which is going to take a
Yeah.
while to do. so
Exactly. And I actually
so
think on the metabolic side or like that endurance side is actually a better metabolic state. Like muscle mass matters, but I actually think
mhm.
like high levels of endurance activity is a much larger metabolic sink, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, yeah, because we have to get into the range of pretty big extremes
Yeah,
within muscle sinks versus just going out for an extra run or something like that and
totally
clearing
agree.
it.
Sweat loss rates and electrolytes can be challenging, especially when the miles pile up and the temps climb. To help solve this problem, I got a sweat test done that suggested that I lose approximately 614 milligrams per liter of sweat when I'm out there working out. Keep up with this, I turned to Element Electrolytes, convenient single-serve packs, and Element Sparkle, which is their latest offering that combines carbonated water and their top-notch electrolyte flavors. Check out their variety of flavors at drinklmnt.com/HPO. If you use that URL, you can get a free sample pack with your first purchase. If it turns out they don't meet your needs, rest assured they have a 30-day money-back risk-free guarantee. Details and link can be found in the show notes.
I'm actually super curious now that I'm on here because I think something that's very interesting about ultra endurance running is actually like mechanical muscle damage being a huge factor for it. What
Mhm.
is your like strength? What does your strength training look like now? Or like anything you do is more neuromuscular training wise? Over the years, has that evolved? What does that look like? Are you trying anything new? Like I'm biased towards strength training based on my background, like blood flow restriction training. Have you tried anything like that?
Yeah, the way I've done it more recently would be, like, I kind of have like a phase, especially like during like the off season, where I'm just focusing on kind of like heavier compound lifts as the
Mm,
primary strength, and just making sure everything is kind of like dialed in there and consistent there. And then as I kind of get into the training, the more structured training of like interval sessions and building up my long run, I start to kind of transition more towards like single leg movements with less like heavyweight type compound movements. And then even more like plyometrics style, like strength work as I'm getting closer to competition. And then I sort of rinse and repeat that rotation throughout, the off season into the season, race season, and then back into off season and that sort of thing. Yeah. I haven't really gotten into the blood restriction stuff. I've looked into it a little bit, but is there a compelling use case that you're finding for that?
Oh, I'm
with respect
a
to
big
endurance?
fan. Yeah, so when I worked in the NFL, we used blood flow restriction training all the time. And I think there's a few different, I'll walk through the different use cases I use it. Number one, so essentially what happens with blood flow restriction training is put a cuff on either the top of your arm or the leg and to a certain pressure to occlude blood flow. And so that means it pretty much stops blood from returning to the heart, but you still get a little blood into the muscle. So you get this big blood pooling effect, either at the muscles below the leg or the muscle below the upper arm, wherever you're wearing the cuff. And it creates this huge metabolic stress, right? And so the body responds to stress. And so that blood pooling creates a metabolic stress that leads to a few different adaptations. Number one is you get very similar adaptations to hypertrophy and strength as you would from heavier lifting to failure. Very similar hypertrophy gains, so gains in muscle size. And that can be beneficial because essentially you lift 20 to 30% of the load you typically would lift for like hypertrophy or heavier weights, for example, where you're going after mechanical tension. And so that's beneficial because you can essentially get very similar hypertrophy gains for a lot less weight. So that leads to less mechanical damage. So if loading's contraindicated, where I'm rehab, I'm hurt, or I just don't want high levels of muscle damage, you can essentially get very similar gains in muscle size, which may be beneficial post-surgery or when you are hurt as a runner. And then muscle strength's like 90 to 95% of what you would get from heavier loads. 90% maybe, again, depends on the literature. It's a little mixed, but again, very similar. If I'm hurt or I'm coming off a surgery or I just can't load heavy, but want those maximum strength gains for performance or rehab, it could get me that with like 20 or 30% of the load where heavy lifting may be contraindicated. So then that also gets into the fact, if I'm a runner who's doing extremely high volumes and I have a lot of mechanical damage and fatigue in the legs, but I want to get some type of neuromuscular stimulus, but I can't do it right now because I'm just so fatigued. We see from literature that it leads to much less muscle damage because you're using significantly less loads. So it's less mechanical fatigue on top of your already muscle damaged legs, you could say, for lack of a better term. And so you could still potentially get some of the strength and hypertrophy adaptations that could potentially improve running economy and other benefits for running, whatever durability with low loads. So those are the really proven use cases. And then those novel use cases of the literature, because that metabolic stress is essentially creating a metabolic environment that's very hard to mimic at the peripheral level that you would get from like extremely intense like intervals to failure. So obviously VO2 max has a few components. One of them is the central component, like the heart's ability to deliver blood and oxygen to the muscle. And then peripherally, can your muscle actually uptake and utilize that oxygen via like capillaries delivering it to the muscle, the mitochondria at the muscle level. And we see that BFR really affects that peripheral side. Makes sense because you're creating a ton of metabolic stress at the muscle. And so some of the novel studies, they've had people like trained with one leg with blood flow restriction training and one without. And the blood flow restriction training, like time to exhaustion was like 200% more in a leg extension task, because essentially what happened is the metabolic stress from blood flow restriction training created all of this like blood flow response that led to more capillaries at the muscle level. And that improved VO2 max. So that's like I deliver more blood, oxygenated blood to the muscles via that metabolic stress, and that improves VO2 max and the local metabolic stress, the local VO2 max at the muscle level. And that's important too, because if you have more capillaries, you can deliver more blood and oxygen. That's an endurance adaptation, which you wouldn't get often, may be hard from typical. And then there's some potential recovery benefits because you're getting more blood, fresh blood flow in and removing old blood as well. I could talk about that more. It's called perfusion or perfusion. But I'm a huge fan of it because the return on investment is very high potentially for low cost. You're using very little weight, so there's very little mechanical damage or mechanical load, and you're potentially getting big gains in hypertrophy and strength, and also potentially endurance adaptations for like very little fatigue cost.
That's interesting. I actually I can't remember the name of the brand, but they had sent me some like blood flow restriction cuffs a couple of years ago, and I just haven't put them into any sort of practice yet. But are there like movements that you would suggest someone in my scenario of training for an endurance race?
When people typically use them for like strength and hypertrophy, we do like a 30, 15, 15, 15 protocol. So it's like 30 reps of light loads, 20, 30% of your max for like squats, lunges, whatever. But one of my favorite ways with runners is calf work. because we know like the calf and foot and Achilles are such huge players, specifically calf musculature for endurance running versus like sprinting, where it's like 50% of the load or like propulsive forces are created below the knee. So like it's a good way you can use super light loads and get a very potent stimulus on the calf musculature without adding a ton of extra fatigue, because that area is often relatively fatigued from high volume of training. So like calf raises, single leg, double leg, high volume, low reps. High volume, low weight, so less mechanical fatigue. And your potential also get some endurance adaptation to the calves too, which I think could be beneficial.
Mm-hmm. So you're putting that cuff then like above the calf muscle in that situation?
You're still putting it above the upper leg because the calf muscle still sits well below where you would put it on the upper leg. It's still seeing reduced blood flow and trapping and pooling of blood at the muscle level. It's like you're working it in the movement, so it still have a lot of potential benefits.
Okay, interesting. All right, well, I'm going to give that a try.
Yeah, man. And for double days, the perfusion rep perfusion stuff is great. So essentially, like, you sit on the couch for 5 minutes with it on, strap it on at the right pressure. You sit there for 5 minutes, so you trap the blood, you release it, and then it sends all that old blood to the heart, and it pumps out fresh blood with fresh nutrients. I always see some novel literature that it may improve recovery if you do a few rounds of that, like 5 rounds of 5 minutes on, 4 minutes off. And because you get that fresh blood flow being rushed in, the old blood flow out, it's acting like a sponge. And that potentially can improve recovery during double days. A lot of the athletes I work with who train twice a day have been finding really good benefits with it after the first session.
Interesting. Is that what like some of those like, I know like the major brands like Normatec or Mueller are making the recovery boots?
It's different.
Air compress? It's different than that?
The air compress versus blood flow restriction is different. So the air compress would actually restrict the blood flow. This is different. I actually think the literature around this is much stronger than that, if I'm being completely honest.
Cool. No, that'll be fun to play around with. So I've
got
one more.
If you have a set, but I can set you a set too.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll check to see what I think they got sent to me a couple of years ago, so maybe there's something better out there at this point. But awesome. No, it'll be fun to play around with it.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, anything that restricts the blood. Any of the systems now are pretty good, honestly.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so I'm trying to think what we were talking about before that. Something carbohydrate based or lack of
carbs
carbohydrate.
Being healthy or not healthy before we went on the strength training BFR tangent.
Yeah, the one thing I do find interesting is I remember when, specifically in ultra running and then marathon running too, when we started seeing this kind of like big wave of like carbohydrate kind of swing into the conversation, was my first thought was, all right, how is this going to get misapplied and create a backlash? Because my thought was like, all right, if we see, someone like myself or someone like a professional marathoner or anyone training aggressively at the professional level in ultra marathon, targeting these really high, maybe 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour side of things, how does that translate to the average person engaging with that content? And my first thought was like, okay, there's going to be people that just plug and play, thinking like, well, if it worked for them, it'll work for me. And then we're going to see like in 5-10 years, this like pendulum swing back, and all of a sudden like low carb will have another like a bump in popularity for a while as people like blow up their digestive systems on races and decide, okay, I'm not just going to titrate down. I'm going to go the opposite direction entirely. Like, do you have any thoughts about that?
There's two areas where I see it being misapplied. Is you hit the nail on the head. Like, everyone sees what the lead runners are doing. I think that applies for them. And for the majority of individuals, it does apply. And so the two things I see where it doesn't apply is now all of a sudden everyone wants to take more than 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour, especially like any marathon runner, and go to 120 grams of carbohydrates per hour. But I actually think when you review a lot of the literature, like I still think 60 to 90 grams for carbohydrates per hour, for some individuals, maybe even lower, like 50 to 90 grams, is still the sweet spot for the majority of runners who are running marathons. Like events shorter than that, you definitely don't need that much. And I'll be completely honest with you, I'm not going to sell you a gel when you don't need a gel. Like half marathons, I typically say 30 to 60 grams per hour, marathons 60 to 90 for the majority. For the individuals who are seeing benefits going above 90 grams, maybe closer to 120 grams, I think it's the elite athletes who have extremely high levels of metabolic turnover. So like an elite athlete like you or an elite marathon runner, like one Joe Kleckler took whatever, 170 grams at New York Marathon. Joe has an extremely high rate of ATP turnover and production than most individuals and a high rate of metabolic turnover. So he has higher level of carbohydrate demands because he produces more energy per hour. So it's kind of like a push-pull system. If you have a higher demand for the carbohydrates because you have the ability to produce so much energy because you're an elite runner, then those are the individuals who probably need high level of carbohydrates above 90 grams per hour. I'm still not convinced based on the current literature that the majority of individuals will see benefits from that. So I think that's one way people are going to go wrong. Like most people still 60 to 90 grams per hour is going to be the sweet spot. More than that, their stomach and body just won't be able to handle it because it's going to be too much. I would say is number one. And we see a huge actually area of personalization for this, where like it actually is personalized, your ability to tolerate and absorb carbohydrates. So that's where we see like carbohydrate oxidation tests become very popular, where they'll actually like use stable isotopes, carbon-13 isotopes, and trace the carbohydrate throughout your body and the drink mix and see how much of the carbs you're actually using and absorbing, which I think is really cool and interesting. So I think that's number one. And the second mistake too is I still think energy balance is super important. So again, like the elite athletes like you who have extremely high volumes of training or other elites, like you eat an extremely large amount of calories or energies and carbohydrates per day because your training demands it. But at the end of the day, that's your energy balance, like your energy in versus energy out. But I see a lot of individuals now too whose energy or their training demands just aren't nearly as high, which is fine. Like not everyone needs those energy demands, but you should match your intake to those demands. Like if you're using what elites are doing as an excuse to just pound calories and calories and calories, and you're actually in an energy surplus. Like I'm a huge fan of fueling. Anyone who knows me knows that. I think those times you should slightly overfuel. I'd much rather have you slightly overfuel than underfuel, depending on your situation. Obviously, context matters, but I don't think the goal is to be in a constant energy surplus. I think the goal is to be in energy balance if you're at a healthy body composition. So if you're not an elite athlete, you don't really need to fuel like one either if you're just running whatever, 50, 60 miles a week.
Sure.
Not just, but you know what I mean. Those are the two big areas where you may be going overboard with calories and carbohydrates.
Yeah, it is one of those things when anytime you see what someone is doing, the next question almost has to be like, well, what lifestyle are you applying that to, and how does that compare to mine?
Exactly. The context is everything.
Yeah. It is interesting now too, because I see almost like the divide occurring between the very high carb and the low carb groups with respect to the high carb groups are kind of looking at this as like we're seeing performance occur at these higher thresholds of carbohydrate intake that go above and beyond just the oxidation side of things.
Yeah.
And they're kind of using competitive pressure maybe to understand that, where it's like we don't have the answer to this exactly yet, but we see it happening at the top of the most competitive sports. And then you have the really low carb folks saying like basically the starting point is 10 grams per hour and above and beyond that needs to be proven as effective.
Yeah. So
they're trying to like minimize it.
Yeah. So that whole argument from that group with the 10 grams of carbohydrates per hour is like the sole goal of carbohydrates is to essentially maintain your blood glucose or your body's blood sugar levels. And as long as you do that, that's all that matters for performance. And we just know that that potentially isn't true because there's potentially other benefits from higher carbohydrate intakes besides blood glucose. From the standpoint of like, it does lead to potentially higher carb oxidation rates, even if you go beyond just maintaining blood glucose at the muscle level. And then there's obviously just a whole string of benefits that are just like super hard to measure. So their whole theory is there's typically two sinks of like glucose, the blood glucose, which is like that small amount of the bloodstream. And then at the muscle level, muscle glycogen is another big storage site of glucose or carbohydrates. And their argument is muscle glycogen doesn't matter. And all that matters is maintaining blood glucose. But we just have a lot of literature that shows that muscle glycogen is probably super important from that standpoint. I'm not going to say, I still think, I think maintaining blood glucose is actually probably more important from endurance performance. But I still think we can't say some of the claims they're saying where muscle glycogen is irrelevant because a lot of the studies they've done, they don't actually directly measure muscle glycogen, even though they're saying it doesn't matter. So it's really hard to say muscle glycogen doesn't matter when you're not actually directly measuring it. And the second thing is we still just have a lot more literature that shows a dose response, positive dose response between carbohydrate ingestion and performance. So like from 30 to 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour, for example, as you increase the carbohydrates in a lot of these other studies, you see improved performance and improved like running economy. Obviously, Dr. James Morton and Jamie Pugh, Sammy, I'm going to mess up Sammy's last name, and them all had a great study from the 30 to 60, 90 to 120 gram of carbohydrates per hour essentially showed a very positive dose-response relationship between the more carbs the individuals, elite runners took on, that the improvements they saw in running economy and performance. So we definitely have a lot more evidence, I would say, towards as you increase carb intake, there's a positive dose-response relationship. And the 10 grams of carbohydrates per hour, that just maintains blood glucose. don't know enough about some of the claims they're making, is what I would say, based on my understanding of the literature, is what I'll say to that. And I do think maintaining blood glucose is important. And yeah, that's what I'll say about all that. But like you alluded to, there's probably a ton of other benefits to carbohydrates that are just really hard to measure that we don't know. Like maybe it's having some benefits on the liver as you run. Maybe like it does maintain higher levels of liver glycogen. So that is something we definitely do know. That like ingesting carbohydrates during a run or during a longer training session helps preserve your liver glycogen, which is another source of stored carbohydrate. And that's important because during the longer duration events towards the end, like your liver will release some of its stored glycogen into the bloodstream to maintain your blood glucose levels, send extra energy to your muscles, but also for your brain. So that's another potential benefit, but also maybe there's benefits from higher carbohydrate intake during runs and like brain benefits, like neurological since it is a fuel source. But yeah, a lot of it is just super complex.
Exogenous ketones have grown in popularity, and with that, lots of marketing and hype. Personally, I am most convinced by the cognitive support and performance benefits at lower intensity training sessions. There is an educational hurdle with these products though, which is why I turn to Delta G ketones, as they invest millions in research and education and have 70 plus clinical studies. They go the extra mile to help you get it right the first time, which is also why they offer a free consultation to help you better understand how your lifestyle can best be leveraged with this product. Head over to deltagketones.com and use promo code BITTER20 for 20% off. Details and links can be found in the show notes.
Yeah, and it is. And I think it's one of those things where the way I look at it is, especially when we get into this world where there's clear biases, right? Like there's like
Exactly.
no question about that. So it's like, well, where can we look at examples where the biases favor us actually getting to the answer of this? And that's where it's like, all right, let's look at the most competitively pressurized sports in the world that their bias is performance, because if they start
Exactly.
making compromises towards performance, there's just going to be someone close enough to them that is going to take advantage of that and beat them. So when we look at like the Tour de France and professional marathoning, the more direct we can get to the actual lifestyle and demands that those sports are requiring, the closer we can get to answering the question within those contexts. And that seems to just drift further and further into the very high carbohydrate
I think
side of things.
this is a really key point where if you look at elite training environments, like that's where we're going to go after the 1%. And if something works and you see a mass adoption, then that means there's probably a signal versus noise there. And so if you look across elite cycling, elite triathlete, and elite running, distance running, like everyone's moving towards higher carbohydrate intake. So that clearly is a signal that there's something there. Like no one is going closer to 10 grams. Everyone's moving in the opposite direction, higher carbs.
Yeah. And I mean, there's two things where I see people maybe getting tripped up with all that. And one is like they'll get into an argument online, and then it just becomes kind of like, how do I prove what I'm saying versus try to understand what's actually going on? And some of that'll be like, well, let's pick an example of someone who did really well with low carb. So like I've gotten used like this a lot of times over the years where it's like, oh, well, right. He broke this world record using low carb. And it's like, yeah, but if you compare me to a professional marathoner, for one, you're comparing a sport that has had a lot less competitive pressure applied onto it. So right away, we have an apples and oranges comparison there. And then on top of that, we have different demands between and I tried to be open about this even when I was low carb, which is like, because people would ask me like, well, what would you do in the marathon? I was like, well, I'd probably have to change my fueling strategy if I wanted to reach my own individual peak performance potential, because the demands of me trying to optimize for the marathon is going to be optimizing at lactate threshold, whereas the demands for me to optimize for 100 miles is more closer to aerobic threshold. So those are like far enough apart from an energy demand standpoint where doors are opened and closed between the two. But yeah, people want to kind of like make it a one size fit all argument versus a contextual one oftentimes. And then I think we run into problems there.
And I think something that we have to look to across elite sport from my time in professional team sports that I always came back to is like, you could be successful despite certain behavior, right? Like performance is super complex and so much goes into it. And a lot of these things we'll talk about with like the in-race fueling, other strategies are like maybe the last 5 to 10%. But like 90% of it is just, are you maintaining like high consistent training volume over time? And are you genetically super gifted? And that's going to explain a large proportion of the performance. And you could be successful despite your carbohydrate intake. Like a long time ago, people were running super fast marathons and not really taking gels. So they're still successful despite what they were doing nutritionally.
Yeah. Well, and that's where the highest amounts of competitive pressure really matter, because now you have a big enough group of these genetic freaks where that's sort of accounted for to a large degree. And now it makes a big difference if they're not fueling the way they should.
Exactly. So we're at the point, as sport evolves, it's a really excellent point.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing about ultra marathoning to me too, is like we're on this kind of continued growth phase right now where like if you go back 5-6 years, you would not see as much congruency between the fueling amongst the top in the sport, to the degree where now you look at like Western states, which has been a little bit easier to tease out what the top performers have been doing, because a lot of the brands and the athletes are reporting those data points.
Yeah.
And it's getting to the point now where like you're just not finding men in the top 10 not getting at least close to 100 grams per hour.
And like you alluded to, I think that lack of variability really says something.
Yeah. You start getting tighter variances as we get closer to having the answer to the question. So it's interesting stuff.
Yeah, like you're seeing across, you see a lot of commonalities probably in the training methodologies as well too. Like the same principles apply to training. Like you can argue over double threshold, single threshold method. It's the same argument I get to people at training. It's like, well, what are these people actually doing when you look at their training? Like maybe the X's and O's look slightly differently, but if you look at the commonalities, it's like they're all just running a ton at race-specific intensity, having easy days, hard days, so they can maintain high training quality, protect their hard days, and probably something to be said about that being the most important factor, rather than if you ran a 600 versus an 800 meter at the track, you know?
Yeah. The other flaw, or potential flaw, I should say, within kind of like the more strict ketogenic type stuff when it comes to this performance, is a lot of the research that we have that points towards some sort of like performance neutralizing thing is, I don't think they're stressing those participants nearly enough for us to really answer that question. So
I agree.
yeah, so like when I think of it this way, is like I remember way back when I first was like I was a couple years into low carb, and one of the things that I was playing around with in those early years was like because low carb is a fairly large umbrella, relatively speaking. You could go like strict
like what does that
ketogenic.
actually mean? Yeah.
Right. So it's like where I was trying to find where the variety within that was going to be good for what I was trying to do. And one of the things I learned early on was strict ketogenic was not the answer for performance, even within the context of running at or below aerobic threshold, because the training demands required to optimize for that still included short intervals, long intervals, targeting a VO2 max, targeting lactate threshold, and things like that. They were just unspecific important variables. So I would do them earlier in the season versus later in the season, like I would if I was training for like a 5K or a half marathon or something like that.
I totally agree. I think go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. So then it got to the point where it's like, well, to be competitive, you need to train like an elite athlete, which meant not 50-mile per week training protocols with one speed session. It was like 100+ mile training weeks with maybe 2 quality training interval sessions and a long run with some quality in it. And I think when I could have done any one of those sessions on a strict ketogenic diet and maintain quality. What I couldn't do is string together 2 or 3 weeks of them. Yeah. So I think that's where the devil's in the details with that is, it's like, yeah, you can go and do a test on people and have them run a 6x800 in a ketogenic state, or one time to failure test or something like that, and maybe get the answer you're looking for. But if you start putting them through an actual endurance training protocol where you're doing a couple interval sessions and a quality long run every week, and you're trying to rinse and repeat that for multiple weeks in a row, I think that's where you see the fall off, or would see the fall off in some of that stuff.
Yeah. I think this brings up an excellent point. I think number one is we also see a trend towards high volume and high quality training, right? Like people across these endurance sports are like, how much volume can I accumulate at high training quality without completely destroying myself? So clearly, I think any type of intervention, whether it's dietary or whatever, that's going to potentially hurt your training consistency and quality is not the right way to go, because I do think consistent training quality and volume over time is most important. So if you're partaking in a diet or some type of intervention that prevents that, that would be a big flag. And you brought up a good point. I think a lot of these studies, and this is actually an argument that if you're pro keto, you can make too, are so short term, and some of these interventions, to understand what the actual effects are going to be on longer term performance, you just need a longer term study, which is super hard to do because they just take time for some of these adaptations to happen.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And the thing I do kind of enjoy about some of it too is I think there's some questions answered. Unfortunately, I think it's the communication half the time that's the problem with these things, where if we take even like the 10-gram side of things, to me, I found that kind of interesting at the very beginning, because it was like there are going to be people who choose to engage with low carbohydrate ketogenic diets and want to do endurance sports for reasons outside of performance. And if that's the way they're finding value for one way or the other through their nutrition, more power to them. But we do need to help them figure out how are they going to go about fueling their efforts, because I think intuitively someone thinks, okay, I'm on a ketogenic diet or a low carbohydrate diet. What's the point of fueling it at all?
Yeah.
And I think what we learned from that study is even if you're on a strict ketogenic diet, small amounts of carbohydrate are going to improve your performance. So now we at least have some data on that.
Showed. And I think this brings up an excellent point about like how we communicate science. And that study wasn't a bad study. It was super interesting. But I think then the authors used it to make claims on social media that were very absolute. And I don't know if actually addressed the nuance of that study. So if you look at the underlying mechanisms or how that study was done, it's super interesting. I agree. Like they definitely showed it potentially maintains blood glucose, which is critical. It was a very small sample size of a study. I think the test was done at like 60-70% of VO2 max, which often you're not racing at. So it's at a lower intensity than what a lot of people race marathons at. They didn't directly measure muscle glycogen. And then like the way they did the time trial test at the end to it wasn't actually representative of how you would race. So they made all these claims about it showing that this is the best way to improve endurance performance, where number one, you actually probably didn't test at intensities that were relevant or tests that were super relevant to how people actually race. You actually didn't load up individuals on carbohydrates or maintain typical carbohydrate feeding patterns leading up to like the time trial test the day before and the morning of that people typically would, which could skew the results. And you had a super small sample size. You didn't actually measure muscle glycogen. So all the claims you were making and the way you communicated those claims were not probably accurate. So it just goes back to like how you actually communicate science as well.
Yeah. I mean, my experience with it was the study comes out, the marketing around it was an insanely exaggerated claims.
Yeah.
And then
like
once
90
those
grams of carbs are dead. It's like, what are you talking about? That's not what you showed at all. Yeah.
Exactly. And then it's like, so that gets everyone's attention, right? Because now all of a sudden we're like, okay, wow, I better look into this because right now I'm pounding 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour.
Exactly.
Or I haven't been and I need to find evidence to prove that I'm doing it right. So everyone's interested then, right? And then we start digging into it, and the people who know what they're talking about start asking the questions about why are you making this insane claim? And then the communicators then they retreat back to something much more modest, where it's like, oh, well, we're not saying elite athlete performance. We're saying
exactly.
So then it's like, okay, I'm gonna defend something way more defensible than the original claim that I insinuated at the onset of the marketing side of things. And then you get this sort of like, you get two sides arguing a different baseline of what was said. So it just kind of like muddies the waters in an unnecessary manner. And it's likely just trying to capture the current landscape of online engagement and stuff, where it's like, instead of trying to actually like answer a question, we're trying to also grow the awareness of something.
So, yeah. And I think it's important to recognize like one study like comes out and it causes us to ask questions, and that's not a bad thing, but then we have to do more studies, follow up research, like other ways to corroborate it or prove that it's true. And so you can't make these definitive claims off one study, but the way science works is like you have a study that maybe makes you ask further questions, and then you try to go through those questions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I engaged with a lot of that commentary when it first came out too, and it was kind of comical to some degree, where it would be like I would see a post that would go up and it would literally say in the post like performance. And I'm like, okay, well, you've set the standard there. That's the claim now, performance. Let's look at that. And then someone would jump in the comments and be like, oh, well, it's not always about the performance. It's about the average person engaging with the sport. And then I would like take this, the initial comment and be like, this is what they claimed we're talking about here. So that's our converse. If we want to talk about the average person, we can do that. But the claim
it's a
was
different
not
lens. But you have to make sure you talk about it through the context you're claiming, which I think is important.
Yeah. So, you could waste all day online if you wanted to arguing these things, but at the end of the day, I
Yeah.
think
Honestly, a lot of people do.
yeah, they do. Yeah, it's interesting stuff, one way or the other. But yeah, so what else? What else is new? Anything that you're interested in right now along the
I think we hit a lot
fueling
of
or
it,
performance
obviously,
world?
like the fueling and performance I find super interesting. Optimizing for like double days, we talked about like some of the supplementation. You've had like Brady and stuff on, so they're much better to talk to about the supplementation than I ever could be. But yeah, like a lot of strength training interventions, super interesting, like durability from a neuromuscular standpoint. Like, is there a way we could potentially improve durability through things like strength training interventions or things that affect more the neuromuscular system? I think we hit on that with some of the gym stuff and BFR, but I do think strength training and other potential modalities from that standpoint is super interesting. But I think we covered a ton of the fueling stuff. I don't know if there's anything else fueling wise you're interested in, but I definitely think it's super interesting like viewing with fueling as a way to support high quality training. And from a recovery standpoint, like how can I use fueling to optimize that? So maybe it's the end of a training session and I'm in an extremely high volume training block with multiple sessions in a day. And maybe I don't need that gel at the end to optimize performance of that session, for example. But that gel may help me replenish glycogen faster once I finish that session. And then maybe as soon as the session finishes, like what's the optimal ratio of like different types of carbohydrates to replenish glycogen as quickly as possible? Or does that matter based on the time into the next session? So the way I like to view it, I think a lot of people view periodization as like a day-to-day thing, but I like to view periodization as how much longer until the next session and what are the demands of the next session. And based on that, that's going to determine like my fueling and recovery
Mhm.
modalities from a nutrition
Yeah.
standpoint.
Yeah, thinking about what's next is definitely, I think, an important piece to that puzzle versus just trying to get through what you're currently doing. That definitely opens
Yeah,
up, I think,
like day to
opportunities.
day, I'm a big fan of fuel for the work required and fuel for the work required rather than be like my daily calorie intake or macronutrients on a 24-hour clock. It's like, what is the next session clock and viewing my macronutrient intake based on that.
hmm It is funny because like there's like this kind of underlying assumption kind of when it comes to like energy intake and caloric needs that there's like this like reset every 24 hours
Yeah, but
where
it's
it's
like,
like
no, that's not how, it's so funny. That's how everyone views it. But it's like, I think it's really interesting. Like people view like energy deficits and energy surpluses like by the day. It's like, oh, today I ate 500 extra calories. Or it's like, but what about like within day? I think something that's really interesting is within day energy deficits and surpluses. Like I just did a 2 hour long run and then I don't eat for 5 hours, but then I have a huge meal 5 hours later. For a few hours of that day, I was in an energy deficit. So within a day, and then I was in a huge energy surplus. And does that
Mhm.
make a difference? Like, did that deficit cause harm for those 5 hours after the session I was recovering? Versus like the surplus later on, would that make a difference? Or if I just was in energy balance consistently throughout the day, rather than the one part of the day being in a huge deficit, than one day being in a huge surplus? And I think there's some interesting literature coming out about that deficit, short-term deficit, like throughout the day, like leading to like different hormonal responses and stress responses versus it being consistent, which I think is interesting. So like, I think for the majority of individuals, nutrient timing isn't that big of a deal, but I think for high volume endurance athletes training multiple times a day, it does become much more relevant for
Mhm.
something like
I
these
mean,
within day deficits.
yeah, and I even wonder about like I mean, it's a relatively small amount compared to the high workloads of an endurance athlete, but just the non-exercise energy
Yeah,
outside of the equation, when we have these kind of weird patterns of eating that potentially kind of put the body in this state of scarcity in maybe like an artificial or in a more of an acute way versus a macro
I
way
think there is
where
some interesting literature. Like people actually down-regulate their non-exercise expenditure. We see like during those energy deficits because like the body's low on fuel, like they'll fidget less, move less, right?
Mhm. Yeah, which,
Yeah.
for someone like you or me in a high training block, 300-400 calories a day of a down regulation might not be something that registers on the
Maybe a
scale in
good,
any meaningful
yeah,
way,
it
but
may be a good thing actually.
right, yeah. But for the average person who's maybe on like a 2,000 calorie per day diet or something like that, that could be a meaningful change in the way that they're engaging with their food and their
100%.
performance and stuff. So, yeah. Yeah, so yeah, I do wonder about that. And I mean that gets into the world of sometimes I think too with like all the fasting stuff and
Exactly.
how
So
that
I think
plays out.
that's one thing I do slightly differently. Like I don't track, like I track my daily macronutrients, but I track it from like session to session rather than being on a 24-hour daily clock and try to have as little within day energy deficits as possible. So like obviously if I have a big training session, I'll eat more close to that. And then throughout the day, I'll eat less. So I
Hmm.
try to maintain very little within day energy deficits. And I think from an energy standpoint, how I feel throughout the day, I've noticed a big difference psychologically and also just like levels of like mental clarity and mental energy. And I think there is something from some of the novel literature coming about like within day energy deficits. If you have huge hours of within day energy deficits, it having some type of like increased stress response and hormonal response, which I think is interesting. So if we can like
Hmm.
mitigate that, you would theoretically argue it can improve recovery too. So I do think viewing nutrition through the lens of how can I manipulate as many nutritional variables as possible to improve my recovery, and that's going to let me train more at higher volume training, which would lead to better performance, I think is something I find very fascinating. And you could do that across other modalities besides nutrition too to optimize your recovery. But I think nutrition is a really interesting one where it's like you view nutrition as a way to support training and recovery as much as possible. It's a recovery modality.
Hmm. Yeah, I know it's funny to think at the individual level too, because I think if I just mindlessly go about my day, my intuition is typically I end up just automatically backloading a bunch of calories
Me
where
too.
I'm way less hungry during the day, and then at night, all of a sudden, I feel like I could probably eat the equivalent of 3 full meals.
Yeah. I just
And
look at the
but
clock. It's like, oh, time for a huge dinner.
right, yeah, yeah. So I find myself trying to actively resist that intuition and push more of my energy intake earlier in the day for all those reasons that you were mentioning. And then
Exactly.
I do find when I'm consistent with that, I get to the end of the day and it's like I'm hungry for dinner and I still probably need a decent
But
amount
you're
of
not like
calories.
ravenous.
Right.
Yeah. I've noticed that
Yeah.
too. It's like, and I think there is something potentially to be said from like the liver glycogen response. Like, obviously, there's just like so many complex interactions and signals going on in the body. But like, if I could really like have an insane session where I'm depleting huge amounts of liver glycogen and glycogen in general, and I don't do a good job of replenishing that, is that a potential signal? Or like, I don't fuel the session well. So like, obviously, if you fuel a session, it protects liver glycogen. Well, maybe I don't feel well, and then like it's a 3 hour run, and like my liver glycogen shot, and it's like, does that destroy hunger signals or something later in the day?
Hmm.
That wasn't a very scientific way to go about it, but it is something I think about, and that leads to like a ravenous overfeeding later in the day.
Yeah, and I wonder how that feeds into the sleep quality side of things too, which is like a
Exactly,
huge recovery lever.
exactly. So they all interact.
Interesting stuff. Well,
Awesome, man.
yeah, Jonah, we'll have to have you back on. I'm sure we'll come up with more topics to chat
No
about
doubt.
or
I want to do some
dive.
more. I'm very curious about your strength training, so we'll have to do some of that stuff.
Yeah, yeah, that'd be fun. Maybe we can do a bigger podcast with that as like kind of the primary topic and
I
dive
would
into
love
that
that,
a little
man.
bit more deep.
Awesome. I really appreciate you having me. Like I said, I'm a huge fan of everything you do here.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I let you go, I mean, I love your Instagram page. I think there's a ton of interesting stuff on there. I know you're active on Substack and places like that too. So if you want to let the listeners know kind of where they
Yeah,
can find you.
I'll send you all my links just so they have it for the show description. But the main areas I'm produce information is I have my newsletter on Beehive Marathon Science, and I'll send you the link. And essentially, it's a free newsletter that translates the latest literature and papers into actionable insights for marathon runners, hybrid athletes. A lot about lifting, nutrition, running, but maybe some of the other stuff that's not always running specific, but still matters a ton. And then I have my Instagram where I share short form videos. I'm across TikTok, Twitter, all of those too. I'll send you all the links. And then launching the YouTube series that will be more in depth, longer, like 20-minute episodes where I'm actually visiting labs throughout the world and some of like the biggest names that like the sports science research, doing testing on myself, and similar to the Instagram, translating that into actionable insights for runners and other hybrid athletes, maybe, but a little more longer form where we actually interview the researchers, but create practical insights. And everyone who signs up for the newsletter stuff gets a ton of like free training plans. So just to convince you, and I'll send you all those links.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate it, Jonah. It's been a great chat and I'm excited to get this one up.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Just a quick reminder that Probio Nutrition is my go-to supplement for all my micronutrients and digestive needs. The reason I like it is it was developed by my good friend, Dr. Mark Bubbs. He has had a lot of experience working with successful individuals that have busy, active lifestyles, including Olympians, NBA basketball players, professional hockey players. One of the things he noticed was a lot of supplements were not only mislabeled, but not very effective. So he went about to try to lower the friction point there by making it as easy as having one scoop of Probio Nutrition every day. I will take it with either water, smoothie, or mix it in with my yogurt once per day, and then I'm done. And I can rest at ease knowing that along with a good diet, I'll have all those micronutrients and digestive needs met. Head over to probionutrition.com and enter promo code ENDURANCE for 20% off your next order. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.